First, let's start with some definitions. Freedom of speech is the right to communicate one's opinions and ideas without fear of government censorship or retaliation. It encompasses the right to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media. And as you'll see if you look online around these topics, while the right is fundamental, it is not absolute, and it may be subject to certain limitations to protect public safety, the rights and reputations of others, and other legitimate interests. And independent media refers to news organisations that operate free from control or influence by governments, corporations, or other external forces. And this independence allows them to report news and express opinions without bias or censorship, fostering a more diverse and informed public discourse. So now we know what we mean by freedom of speech and independent media. And even in those two definitions, you may start to have already thought, what are the issues with that? Not least that if you're allowed to have freedom of speech unless an organisation or a government decides that that freedom of speech is dangerous, then who is making those restrictions? Who is imposing those penalties, if you like? And what I'm going to talk about now is less to do with how this can be governed and whether or not one or more parties involved should be more or less lenient. What I'm going to talk about is, let's assume that we believe that freedom of speech is a fundamental right that should be upheld. And let's assume that independent media is a worthy course due to not necessarily wanting all media to be controlled by parties that could be in theory manipulative or coercive. Assuming that's the case, how can we create that scenario? Because as I observe the landscape of freedom of speech and independent media, it occurs to me that it's not structurally designed to do what it's meant to. I genuinely don't believe it's fit for purpose. And I don't believe that's because of the people involved. I believe it's because the alternatives haven't been widely distributed yet. And at this moment, I just want to quickly interject that I don't mean that there are no brilliant independent media sources. And there are certain outlets such as Ground News or Truth Social, and there's kind of censorship-free video platforms like Rumble. What I'm talking about is that all of those are fundamentally built on top of structures that can manipulate, censor, and coerce. So even if you create something that is tremendously independent and tremendously free, if it can still be not independent and not free, then unsurprisingly, we're constantly at a disadvantage to our ideals. So as we look around the landscape now, we see that we're living in a time when there are thinkers and philosophers and business people who are saying things that seem to make sense, but are subject to being cancelled and subject to being moved away from the spotlight, as it were. And as Dresden James once said, when a well-packaged web of lies has been sold gradually to masses over generations, the truth will seem utterly preposterous and its speaker a raving lunatic. And I do wonder whether we're living in a time now where we've never more needed sense and common sense to be discussed, but never more in a time where those discussions can be shut down. Noam Chomsky said that the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, and even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. Indeed. This, I suspect, is the case. So we think we're inside a democratic environment where we can discuss these opinions, but I think that that is probably untrue, and we are inside a strictly controlled environment. And that is because, I believe, the large technology firms that are the rails upon which our discussions happen are able to be bought, controlled and politicized and weaponized, in fact, by organizations and governments who have different agenda at play. And after all, independent media is only as independent as the most dependent part. So if we are creating, let's say, a new tool that can bring people into a more democratic environment, that is only as democratic as the least democratic part of it. In the same as centralization, you're only as decentralized as the most centralized element. This is the way that nature is constructed. We have to be very careful that if we're constructing a tool or a platform that people can discuss freely on, who are the third-party intermediaries that are controlling the flow of that information? Because that is then the attack vector, as it were. And as we see society swarming towards comforting lies, we have constantly changing narratives. We have the reduction of people's physical movement and increased isolation and the removal of counter-arguments. And to Dresden James's point earlier, if you speak about the truth of this, the rejection is somewhat quite troubling and loud in its vocal ability. Even talks like I'm giving to you now will almost unarguably be rejected by the very same people who would really want freedom of speech and independent media. But as soon as I say, well, there's a fundamental flaw in the architecture of that, they could well disengage. For those who want to listen on, I will give the answers to what we could do differently. But it requires a relatively thick skin and a level of introspection about today's modern society of the technology landscape we live in. We, as people, are within a dopamine-spiked infrastructure of greed, fear, and comparison. We are en masse slaves to a system that is controlling our thoughts without us knowing. And one of the bias blind spots that we have is even by thinking that we are not coerced by that is in and of itself part of the trick. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled, according to the Usual Suspects character, was to convince the world that he didn't exist. So we look around the latest and greatest technologies like artificial intelligence, and the leaders of these firms are saying that they want to fix factual errors and provide accurate information. This is about controlling human knowledge forever. This is about being able to edit history so that as we are absolutely addictedly to Mr. ChatGPT and enamored by the wonders of large language models, we are building an even greater echo chamber, a greater prison for us to be amused by. We are thinking that things are relatively normal, but in fact they've got so perverse and so distinctly different from what common sense would look like, really, that we don't even notice it. It's a well-packaged web of lies. This is called, functionally, the Overton window. And the Overton window is when things that were in the past, unthinkable or radical become acceptable and then relatively sensible and then become popular and then become policy. And so it creeps up at us. We don't necessarily know it's happening. It's like a frog in a saucepan of gradually boiling water is probably unaware of its fate. But of course, if you just dropped a frog into a boiling water pan, it would attempt to jump straight back out again. Similarly to our situation, if you put someone from 2012 into a 2022 COVID situation, they would probably reject it straight away. But if you gradually creep up, you don't necessarily feel it. And that is undoubtedly what's happening. And if we look at big tech, the system itself is absolutely unconcerned about what's right and wrong. It's about the means to an end. And the end justifies whatever means. It's blissfully free from the complications of morality. This is the circumstance in which we actually live. This isn't a rebellious call to arms. This is a statement of fact of the world in which we dwell. And therefore, if we want to build freedom of speech for us as the public and independent media without the coercive control, we have to think about the structure upon which we're building these things. You see, modern platforms, if we were to think of them like a vehicle, they're designed for manipulation with the ambition of power and control, and they're fueled by personal data. That's the way that the machine operates. And if you want to remove their power supply, you need to fundamentally redesign the vehicle. It's not something of designing a new website that has a really cool name, and we'll move people from Twitter to Blue Sky. We'll move people from Washington Post to Ground News. We'll move people from this to... That's not going to do it. It's not going to cut it, because the system upon which you're building those free platforms are fueled by our personal data. So we have to absolutely address the fueling mechanism first before we can actually think about what to build on top of it. And this is when I get a lot of pushback as well in my career from decades of people saying, yeah, but no one cares about that. No one cares about privacy. No one cares about personal self-sovereignty. You know, look around. How many people really care about that? And I would quote Edward Snowden at this point. Arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. It is not linked as a topic. The fact that you may not have anything to hide is fundamentally unlinked to the human rights to privacy. And the fact that you have nothing to say is fundamentally unlinked to the human rights to free speech. If we want to create the tools in which we can freely speak and the media upon which we can freely communicate, we have to structure that in a way that eliminates the need for the central authorities and the intermediaries and so forth. And this rings a bell around the type of structures that we were speaking about in the 90s. We were talking about how would this actually work? Like, what would it really require as a tech stack? And what we were talking about then was a technology that eliminates the need for central authorities and intermediaries, and without the singular points of control and decision making, for that to be externalized, distributing it amongst all participants in the network. All transactions and all data and information should be publicly visible and verifiable so that it's accountable and it reduces the potential of fraud and manipulation. It would require some form of advanced cryptography to secure the data and transactions, making it extremely difficult to alter or tamper with the information stored. And our view then, and now, in fact, is that by removing the intermediaries and streamlining processes, technology can significantly reduce costs and transaction times. It can enable individuals and organizations to interact and transact with each other without needing to trust a central authority or third party. And once a transaction or data is recorded, it can't be altered or deleted, creating an immutable and verifiable record of events. This was what we were talking about in the 90s. And it eventually became known as the blockchain. And at this moment, don't roll your eyes and think, oh yeah, I know that it's, this whole blockchain thing, I've heard about Bitcoin. But actually, no. What we were trying to describe in the 90s has actually been so manipulated out of its original meaning. A cynic would argue that that was actually done on purpose, so we don't realise the extraordinary libertarian tool power that the blockchain would be. In fact, what we got was Doge. We got meme coins. We got dogs with hats. We got one-page overviews from offerings that bring in billions of dollars of public money. We have presidents who rug pull nations and the world with meme coins. We have a regulated genius bill passed for stable coins to be now commonplace, all of which, every single thing I have said, is the exact opposite of what we actually wanted. None of this creates a better vehicle. All of this creates the next thing, the next version of the manipulative, coercive, big technology environment. So what's next has to be what we meant to build from the 90s. It has to mean that there is a way that you as a person and the person you are transacting with in terms of information or as value are the only parties involved in that transaction. If you want a free speech and independent media, only the parties involved should be involved. The issues with independent media and freedom of speech is that there are other parties with separate agenda. If there were a technology without that separate agenda, like the blockchain, all you have is those people involved together. And that is exactly why what I'm building at Self, and you can go to self.app and read all about this, that is why I genuinely believe we can build these tools. We can use the most advanced technologies inside them to be smart and intelligent, but under our individual control without the manipulative, coercive moves of others. That's the future. I genuinely believe the future of technology is yours.